Imagine this scenario. You're in the early stages of a relationship. It's exciting, new, and full of potential. He texts you often, compliments you, and seems interested in your life. You begin to imagine a future together, but slowly things start to shift. The texts become less frequent, the compliments fade. When you try to discuss your feelings, he pulls away or shuts down. Conversations about the future are avoided, and you feel like you're the only one invested in making the relationship work. Suddenly, you're confused, questioning yourself. Is it me? Is something wrong with our relationship? The unsettling truth is, you might be dealing with someone who is emotionally unavailable. This kind of relationship can be deeply confusing and emotionally draining, especially when you care about the person but can't seem to get past the emotional walls they've built around themselves. In this documentary, we will dive deep into the hidden signs of emotional unavailability. Through psychological research, personal stories, and practical advice, we'll explore why some men struggle to connect emotionally and what you can do if you find yourself in such a relationship. Chapter 1. The early red flags. Recognizing emotional unavailability. Early. On many women in relationships with emotionally unavailable men don't realize what's happening until they're already emotionally invested. Emotional unavailability isn't always obvious in the beginning. These men often start off charming and attentive, but over time, you'll start to notice subtle signs that something's wrong. Number 1. He's non-communicative or bad at communication. Communication is often the first area where problems arise. In a healthy relationship, both partners feel comfortable expressing their thoughts and emotions, even when the conversation is difficult. But emotionally unavailable men tend to avoid these kinds of discussions. Instead, they offer vague responses, deflect, or completely shut down when emotional topics arise. A study published in the Journal of Marriage and Family found that individuals with avoidant attachment styles often struggle with communication in intimate relationships. They tend to shut down emotionally when faced with intense feelings or discussions, fearing that they might lose control or be hurt. Avoidant attachment is often linked to early childhood experiences where emotions were neglected or dismissed. These men learned early on that expressing their emotions wasn't safe or productive, so they developed a pattern of emotional suppression. As adults, they avoid communication about feelings because it makes them uncomfortable or triggers anxiety about being vulnerable. Let's take an example. Take the story of Natalie and Rob. Natalie had been dating Rob for about 6 months when she started noticing his reluctance to talk about their relationship. Whenever she brought up topics like future plans or even her own emotions, Rob would respond with a joke or change the subject.
No, it's like the snowstorm.
What?
You know, in the glass ball. Well, isn't it almost? It is.
You're never gonna change.
It wasn't that he didn't care about Natalie. He just didn't know how to engage in meaningful emotional conversations because it triggered his deep-seated fear of vulnerability. What you should do: if you notice early on that your partner is avoiding communication, it's important to address the issue. Have an open conversation about how you feel and ask him why he struggles with emotional discussions. If he's willing to acknowledge the issue and work on it, there may be hope for improvement. But if he shuts down or refuses to engage, it's a red flag that emotional intimacy may never develop in the relationship. Number 2, he avoids commitment or labels. Another common sign of emotional unavailability is an aversion to commitment. Does your partner seem hesitant to put a label on the relationship? Does he avoid discussing where things are headed or deflect when you bring up topics like exclusivity, moving in together, or future plans? Men who are emotionally unavailable often fear commitment because it requires emotional investment and vulnerability. For them, being in a committed relationship means opening up in ways they're not comfortable with, so they prefer to keep things casual. This allows them to enjoy the benefits of companionship without the emotional risks that come with a deeper connection. Let's take an example. Consider Sarah's experience with James. They had been dating for nearly a year, spending weekends together, and even meeting each other's families.
And we're really lucky that I think the narrative that Sarah just explained sort of gave the impetus for it to grow so exponentially, so quickly. And, we can't run it on our own anymore because of its size.
But every time Sarah brought up the idea of being exclusive, James would respond with vague statements like, "I'm just not ready for labels," or "let's not rush things." Eventually, Sarah realized that James was emotionally unavailable. He enjoyed the relationship, but he wasn't willing to fully commit because it would force him to confront his own emotional barriers.
You ever think of a towel until the hands are wet?
Nobody.
Nobody. Where's that towel?
Wait, Fancy. I believe you have a smell of dust on your forehead.
I do?
Let me. It seems done. Hold still.
What you should do. If your partner avoids commitment, it's important to consider whether you're willing to wait for him to change. While some men may eventually work through their fears, many emotionally unavailable men will never be able to commit. It's crucial to set boundaries and decide how long you're willing to stay in a relationship that doesn't fulfill your emotional needs. Number 3, he's overly focused on his independence. Does your partner constantly talk about needing space or maintaining his independence? While it's healthy to have boundaries in a relationship, emotionally unavailable men often take this to the extreme. They may refuse to integrate their lives with yours, avoid making long-term plans, or keep parts of their life completely separate. According to psychologists, emotionally unavailable men often cling to their independence as a way to protect themselves from emotional vulnerability. They fear that merging their life with someone else's will make them lose control, and they avoid emotional closeness to maintain their sense of autonomy. Let's take an example. Jessica had been dating Tom for nearly 2 years.
This is my future, and I want you to be a part of it.
Yeah, well, maybe we don't get what we want. Clark, I'm just in your way.
But no matter how close they got, Tom always kept parts of his life separate. He had his own group of friends that Jessica was never introduced to, and he made it clear that he valued his personal time above everything else. At first, Jessica admired Tom's independence, but over time, she realized that his emotional distance was preventing their relationship from growing. If your partner is overly focused on his independence, it's important to assess whether this is a temporary phase or a sign of deeper emotional unavailability. Independence is healthy, but a relationship requires a certain level of emotional closeness and interdependence. If he's unwilling to let you into his life in meaningful ways, it may be a sign that he's not ready for a serious relationship. Chapter 2. The deeper psychology behind emotional unavailability. Understanding why some men are emotionally unavailable requires a deeper dive into the psychological roots of their behavior. While everyone has their own unique story, there are common psychological patterns that often contribute to emotional unavailability. Number 1. Fear of vulnerability and rejection. At the core of emotional unavailability is often a deep fear of vulnerability. For many men, the idea of opening up emotionally is terrifying because it leaves them exposed to the possibility of being hurt or rejected. This fear is often unconscious, but it manifests in behaviors like shutting down emotionally, avoiding commitment, or keeping people at a distance. Psychological research. A study by the American Psychological Association found that men who struggle with emotional intimacy often have a fear of vulnerability rooted in past experiences of rejection or abandonment. They've learned to protect themselves by building emotional walls, which prevent them from forming deep, meaningful connections. Let's take an example. Michael had always been guarded in his relationships. He was afraid of getting too close to anyone because he'd been hurt before. When he was younger, his first serious girlfriend broke up with him unexpectedly, and it left a lasting scar. Since then, Michael had been in several relationships, but he always kept his emotional distance, fearing that if he let someone in, he would eventually be hurt again. What you should do. If your partner has a fear of vulnerability, it's important to approach the situation with compassion. Let him know that it's safe for him to open up and that you won't judge him for his emotions. However, it's also crucial to recognize that you can't force someone to be vulnerable if they're not ready. If your partner refuses to work on his emotional walls, it may be time to reevaluate the relationship. Number 2. Unresolved trauma and past relationships. In many cases, emotional unavailability is linked to unresolved trauma from past relationships. Men who have been deeply hurt in the past may struggle to open up in future relationships because they're afraid of experiencing that same pain again. This can manifest as emotional detachment, avoidance of commitment, or an inability to fully invest in the relationship. Trauma can have a lasting impact on a person's ability to connect emotionally. Men who have experienced betrayal, abandonment, or emotional neglect in previous relationships often carry those wounds into future relationships. To protect themselves from further pain, they build emotional walls that make it difficult for them to engage fully with their partner. Let's take an example. David had been married before, but his marriage ended when his wife left him for someone else. The betrayal devastated him, and after the divorce, David found it difficult to trust anyone. He started dating again, but every time a relationship got serious, he would pull away. He was emotionally unavailable because he couldn't shake the fear that opening up would only lead to more pain.
To respect the time you've had together, to not let resentments control your life and lead you to act out. And
what you should do. If your partner's emotional unavailability is tied to past trauma, it's important to encourage him to seek professional help. Therapy can be incredibly helpful in addressing unresolved trauma and learning how to build healthier emotional connections. However, it's also important to protect your own emotional well-being. If your partner is unwilling to work on his issues, it may be time to consider whether the relationship is truly meeting your needs. Number 3. The role of childhood experiences. Our early childhood experiences have a profound impact on how we relate to others as adults. For many emotionally unavailable men, their inability to connect emotionally stems from unresolved issues in their past. Men who grew up in households where emotions were neglected, dismissed, or ridiculed often struggle with emotional intimacy in adulthood. According to attachment theory, children who grow up in emotionally distant families often develop avoidant attachment styles. These children learn to suppress their emotions because expressing them wasn't safe or productive. As adults, they continue this pattern, avoiding emotional intimacy and keeping their partners at a distance. Let's take an example. Adam grew up in a household where emotions were rarely discussed. His father was emotionally distant, and his mother was often preoccupied with her own problems.
Compare me to my father.
I didn't compare you to him. I said you were acting like him.
You're exactly like your mother. Everything you're complaining about her, you're doing. You're suffocating Edward.
As a child, Adam learned that expressing his feelings didn't lead to comfort or support, so he stopped trying. As an adult, Adam found it difficult to open up to his partners. Even though he wanted to connect, his fear of emotional intimacy made it difficult for him to fully engage in his relationships.
Fucked her. You should be upset that I had a laugh with her.
Do you love her?
No, but she didn't hate me. You hated me.
What you should do. If your partner's emotional unavailability stems from his childhood experiences, it's important to approach the situation with empathy and understanding. Encourage him to explore his past and how it might be affecting his current relationships. Therapy can be incredibly helpful in addressing these deep-rooted issues. However, it's also important to set boundaries and protect your own emotional well-being if he's not willing to work on these issues. Chapter 3. The emotional impact on you. How emotional unavailability affects your mental health. Being in a relationship with an emotionally unavailable man can take a significant toll on your mental health. Over time, you may find yourself feeling lonely, frustrated, and emotionally drained. It's important to recognize how his emotional unavailability affects you and what you can do to protect yourself. Number 1. You feel unseen and unimportant. One of the most damaging effects of being with an emotionally unavailable partner is the constant feeling of being unseen. No matter how much you try to connect, it feels like your emotions don't matter. You may express your needs and desires, but they go unheard or unacknowledged, leaving you feeling invisible. Feeling unseen in a relationship can have a profound impact on your self-esteem. When your emotional needs aren't met, you may begin to question your worth, wondering if you're asking for too much or if you're not deserving of love. A study from Stanford University found that individuals who feel emotionally neglected in relationships are at a higher risk for anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. When you're constantly chasing after emotional validation that never comes, it can leave you feeling drained and unworthy. Let's take an example. Laura had been in a relationship with Jason for 3 years. Despite her best efforts to communicate her feelings, Jason remained emotionally distant. He rarely acknowledged Laura's emotional needs, and over time, she began to feel like she didn't matter in the relationship. No matter how much she gave, it was never enough to break through Jason's emotional walls.
Talented people in front of and behind the camera that made some good contributions to this show. So
what you should do. If you feel unseen in your relationship, it's important to express your feelings to your partner. Let him know that his emotional distance is affecting your well-being and that you need more emotional support. If he's willing to work on the relationship, there may be hope for improvement. But if he continues to ignore your emotional needs, it may be time to reconsider the relationship. Number 2, you're walking on eggshells. Do you find yourself constantly tiptoeing around your partner's emotions, afraid of saying or doing something that might push him away? This is a common experience for people in relationships with emotionally unavailable partners. You may avoid bringing up certain topics or downplay your feelings, fearing that any emotional conversation will cause them to withdraw. Walking on eggshells in a relationship is emotionally exhausting. When you're constantly second-guessing yourself, it can lead to feelings of anxiety and self-doubt. You may begin to suppress your own emotions, prioritizing your partner's needs over your own in an attempt to keep the peace. Let's take an example. Every time Jenna tried to have a serious conversation with her boyfriend, Matt, he would shut down.
Can I have it? Please.
Over time, Jenna learned to avoid emotional topics, fearing that any conversation about their relationship would make Matt pull away. She began walking on eggshells, constantly afraid of saying something that would upset him. As a result, Jenna's emotional needs were never met, and she felt increasingly isolated in the relationship. What you should do. If you find yourself walking on eggshells in your relationship, it's important to address the issue head-on. Have an open conversation with your partner about how his emotional unavailability is affecting you. If he's willing to work on the relationship, it's important to set boundaries and ensure that your emotional needs are being met. However, if he continues to shut down emotionally, it may be time to consider whether the relationship is truly fulfilling. Chapter 4. Can he change? The hope and the hard truth. Many women in relationships with emotionally unavailable men cling to the hope that one day he'll change. And while change is possible, it's important to recognize that it can only happen if he's willing to do the work. Number 1. The possibility of growth. Emotional availability isn't something that comes naturally to everyone, but it can be developed. If your partner is willing to acknowledge his emotional unavailability and take steps to address it, there's hope for change. However, this process requires self-awareness, vulnerability, and often professional help. Studies show that emotionally unavailable individuals who engage in therapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can make significant strides in emotional intimacy. Therapy helps them identify the root causes of their emotional distance and develop healthier ways to connect with their partner. Let's take an example. After years of emotional distance, Karen's boyfriend, Steve, finally agreed to see a therapist. It was hard at first. Steve hated talking about his feelings, but slowly he began to open up. With the help of therapy, Steve started to understand the fears and insecurities that were holding him back from emotional intimacy. Over time, he became more emotionally available, and their relationship grew stronger.
But nothing's happened. When I took the car, I didn't know Amy was in there. I mean, I never kidnapped her. She was never in any danger.
Why didn't you bring her back when you knew you'd gone?
Well, what kind of mother would leave a baby?
What you should do. If your partner is willing to acknowledge his emotional unavailability and seek help, there's hope for the relationship. Encourage him to seek therapy or explore other ways to improve his emotional health. However, it's important to set realistic expectations. Change takes time, and it's not guaranteed. Number 2. When to walk away. Unfortunately, not everyone is willing to change. If your partner shows no interest in addressing his emotional unavailability and continues to avoid emotional intimacy, it may be time to walk away. Holding on to the hope that he'll change when he's shown no signs of wanting to can keep you stuck in an emotionally draining relationship. Leaving a relationship with an emotionally unavailable partner can be difficult, especially if you've invested a lot of time and energy into the relationship. However, staying in a relationship where your emotional needs aren't met can have long-term negative effects on your mental health and well-being. Let's take an example. After 2 years of trying to connect with her emotionally unavailable boyfriend, Sarah realized that he wasn't going to change. Despite her best efforts to communicate her feelings, he remained distant and uninterested in addressing their emotional issues. Eventually, Sarah made the difficult decision to end the relationship, recognizing that she deserved someone who could meet her emotional needs. What you should do. You've communicated your needs and given your partner the opportunity to work on the relationship, but he remains emotionally unavailable. It's important to consider whether staying in the relationship is in your best interest. Leaving a relationship is never easy, but sometimes it's the healthiest choice. Chapter 5. Empowering yourself. What to do if he's emotionally unavailable. If you've recognized the signs and understand that your partner is emotionally unavailable, what should you do? The most important step is to prioritize yourself and your emotional well-being. Here are some practical steps you can take to protect yourself and move forward. Number 1. Set boundaries. Healthy relationships require healthy boundaries. If your partner continues to be emotionally distant, it's crucial to establish boundaries that protect your emotional well-being. This might mean limiting your expectations or deciding not to invest any further until he shows a willingness to grow. Let's take an example. Jessica had been in a relationship with Mark for over a year, but Mark was emotionally unavailable. After months of feeling frustrated and unheard, Jessica decided to set clear boundaries. She told Mark that unless he was willing to address their emotional issues, she couldn't continue the relationship. Setting boundaries helped Jessica protect her emotional health and gave her the clarity she needed to make decisions about the future of their relationship. What you should do. If your partner is emotionally unavailable, it's important to set boundaries that protect your emotional well-being. Communicate your needs clearly and let your partner know what you're willing and not willing to tolerate in the relationship. If he's willing to work on his emotional availability, you can continue to invest in the relationship. But if he remains distant, it's important to protect your own well-being. Number 2. Focus on your own growth. While it's natural to want your partner to change, it's also essential to focus on your own personal growth. Surround yourself with supportive friends and family, and consider therapy for yourself to process the emotional toll the relationship has taken. Prioritizing your own well-being will help you regain your sense of self-worth and emotional strength. Let's take an example. After ending her relationship with an emotionally unavailable partner, Megan decided to focus on her own growth. She began seeing a therapist to work through the emotional wounds left by the relationship, and she spent more time with friends who supported her. Over time, Megan regained her confidence and learned that she deserved a partner who could meet her emotional needs.
I've learned about him, I learned through him, as opposed to having grown up around different news.
What you should do. If you've been in a relationship with an emotionally unavailable partner, it's important to prioritize your own growth and well-being. Consider seeking therapy to work through the emotional impact of the relationship and focus on building a support system of friends and family who understand and validate your feelings. The courage to choose yourself. At the end of the day, the most important relationship you have is the one with yourself. Being in a relationship with an emotionally unavailable man can be draining and frustrating, but it doesn't have to define your worth. You deserve a partner who is emotionally available, willing to grow, and capable of building a deep, meaningful connection. If your partner can't or won't meet you halfway, it's time to prioritize your own happiness. Letting go of a relationship that no longer serves you is an act of courage, and it opens the door to healthier, more fulfilling connections in the future. Remember, emotional availability is key to a thriving relationship. If you find yourself constantly feeling unimportant, misunderstood, or neglected, it's a sign that something needs to change. Love isn't about chasing after someone's affection. It's about mutual respect, vulnerability, and emotional connection.